Good evening, everybody. For those of you who may not know or who are new to Christ Church, my name is Alexander McPhail. I have the privilege of being the rector of this wonderful church, and I'm so glad that you can come for this very special event. I need to begin. I should also welcome those of you who are joining us via YouTube this evening. Before offering a prayer, and actually a couple prayers and an introduction, I need to begin really with the most important announcement for those of you who are new, which is to let you know where the bathrooms are. So if you need them, you simply go through either one of these side doors, and eventually, if you keep going that direction, you will find yourself looking at a hallway that at the end of it, there's a water fountain. If you take a left at the water fountain, you will find a women's room and then a men's room at the other end of that hall. Let us pray, and I'd like to offer two collects, one for social justice and the other one of the most powerful, I think, and eloquent collects in our Book of Common Prayer, simply called For Our Country. Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, who hast given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend our liberties, and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endue with the spirit of wisdom those to whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In the time of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in the day of trouble, suffer not our trust in thee to fail. All which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It is my great privilege to introduce Isabel Thornton, who is a lifelong member of this church. She has her Bachelor of Arts from the University of Virginia in Architectural History, a Master's in Historic Preservation, and a Master's in Urban Planning from the University of Southern California. Isabel is the founder and executive director of the Roanoke nonprofit organization Restoration Housing. Tonight she will be presenting information on race-based policies and urban design practices that have negatively shaped all cities, including our own, as well as highlighting some of Roanoke's distinct history. Please welcome Isabel Thornton.
Thank you, Reverend McPhail. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. My name is Isabel Thornton, and as he mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Restoration Housing and lifelong member of Christ Church, so I'm very humbled to be here today. I don't feel like I am an expert in any way, and I'm learning a lot myself, learning every day, and so I just want to share what I've learned so far and try to shed light on some things that I think are both unfortunate but true to our history in Roanoke. So I run a nonprofit. Mission is to develop affordable rental properties for the benefit of limited income families and individuals through the rehabilitation and preservation of historic architectural resources. That's a mouthful. But we restore blighted and vacant properties. They're often in Roanoke's older historic neighborhoods. And in trying to find projects to do each year, I have been curious as I move through, it's been 7 years now, just trying to understand the reason behind why so many houses suffer in these specific neighborhoods and why the living conditions within the homes that are occupied are so substandard. And so I've really just been curious and exploring over the years and trying to learn more. When I first started, the first project that we rehabbed is just a couple blocks north of us here on Day Avenue. This is 530 Day Avenue, and it was built at the turn of the century. It was vacant for 10 years when we acquired it through fundraising, and it had been in such a severe state of deterioration that the previous two owners who had tried to restore it into a single-family home couldn't justify the means to restore it because, like many people investing in rehabbing homes, they were looking for a resale value that you couldn't get for that level of work that was needed. So let me just make sure that's paused. So we came in as a nonprofit not looking for return on our investment, which was really key. And we used historic tax credits to offset the price of the construction, which was quite hefty, and turned it into 2 affordable units in a way that I think is quite subtle. There is a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit on the ground floor and a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom on the second story that you enter through the rear. But it's integrated very discreetly into a block that is mostly single-family homes, but at affordable rents, and is a really, I think, high-quality unit that doesn't at all match what was there before. But like I said, it had been vacant for 10 years. So we, our next project is also in technically the Old Southwest Historic District, which is a national district, but it's more in the Mountain View side. It's on Patterson between 10th and 11th. This house was in a similar severe state of deterioration, but had recently been occupied. And so I was able to see the living conditions that families had been experiencing inside of it right before we started our rehab, and they were really devastating. It was structurally unsound. There were holes in the ceilings with diaper boxes taped up over the holes to keep water from coming in. There were holes in the floor, inadequate or non-existent heating and cooling systems, exposed wires, you name it, just, lead paint flecks everywhere. And it was just very substandard and upsetting to see. And again, so doing these first couple of projects, I became curious, how are these conditions so common in our older historic neighborhoods? If you're driving down Elm Avenue here, as many of us do, it's a major thoroughfare. These are older, beautiful, older historic Victorian homes that would have been, really shiny in their heyday, with severe states of deterioration up close, with families living inside of them. And I know that the living conditions inside of them are quite bad. And so looking back where we were 100 years ago, as many of you know, Old Southwest was kind of one of the premier neighborhoods to live in about 100 years ago in the teens and 20s. And you had these big, beautiful homes and tree-lined streets. And I believe it still is a really lovely place to live, and there really are still a lot of great, beautiful homes. I don't mean to criticize this neighborhood, but I think we can all collectively agree that there are parts that really need a lot of improvement. If you look north of Elm and you look Marshall and Chapman and Patterson Avenue and going further into the West End, and to really understand how it went from Patterson Avenue 100 years ago to where it is now, you have to go pretty far back, about 130 years ago, I think, to get this full picture. And so I created a timeline because I think there are so many different forces at play over the course of this timeline that it's hard to kind of see how they all connect and play into each other, but they do. And many of us, if not all of us, know about Jim Crow laws, and we know about redlining and urban renewal, maybe not in depth, but it's hard sometimes to piece them all together and how they all affected each other or I guess encouraged one another. And so in the 1890s, Jim Crow laws were established in southern states with this idea of separate but equal facilities, segregating schools, businesses, and public transportation. And what that looked like in Roanoke was the growth of the predominantly African American community of Gainsboro, which is just north of downtown. On the left is a picture looking above the railroad tracks, and you have Jefferson Street on the right, the Higher Ed Center, and the old Norfolk and Western, is that right? No, I think, yeah, Norfolk and Western building. And then all the houses in the top left corner are houses in Gainsboro, and then Henry Street on the left side. And Henry Street was the main commercial corridor that served the neighborhood, as African Americans were not allowed, because of segregation and Jim Crow, to use other public facilities and commercial businesses. There were lawyers' offices, doctors' offices, a hospital, theaters, hotel, and this really impressive, amazing community with incredible creativity, often compared to like a smaller Harlem Renaissance. That, in talking to Jordan Bell, who's here tonight, and a wonderful historian on the neighborhood, could tell you about some of the amazing figures that came and performed at theaters there. And it was just very thriving and bustling and active. While it was born out of segregation, it was a very insular neighborhood that that produced, I think, amazing things, ultimately. But Jim Crow mostly limited access to public space, and in southern cities and states, that never seemed to be enough. And many cities and states went further by trying to create zoning ordinances and deed restrictions limiting where African Americans could live. So in Roanoke, from 1911 to 1917, we had two city ordinances that required blacks and whites to live apart, including a law that created 4 segregated districts where blacks were required to live, which was mostly in the Gainsboro neighborhood and to the north of it. And these remained until 1917, when they were ruled unconstitutional. Again, this was this constant push and pull, where Roanoke City leaders then again in 1921 kept trying to find ways to segregate housing and neighborhoods. And council members proposed a resolution asking whites not to sell property in their neighborhoods to blacks and blacks not to buy it, saying that this would be, quote, regarded as in violent conflict with the characteristic customs of our splendid citizenship. And as you can see, there's just like this constant dance back and forth between southern cities and states' efforts to segregate neighborhoods, and then it being shot down by the federal government in many cases. In this case, the proposal or the ordinance was not passed because of opposition by black leaders in the community, thankfully. And what ended up happening is, I think the white citizens' success in really trying to segregate neighborhoods came closest in deed restrictions that were not able to be shot down as easily by the courts. So when I say deed restrictions or deed covenants, they're the same thing. A deed covenant encompasses an entire subdivision community, whereas a deed restriction might refer to a specific property. So in the 1920s, Roanoke is this boom town, and we're starting to build all these new suburbs, what I would call second-rung suburbs. So our older historic neighborhoods are our first-rung suburbs, and our second-rung suburbs move further out, like Raleigh Court, South Roanoke. And in these new suburbs, there were restrictive covenants that prevented the sale of properties in them to not only blacks, but also Lebanese, Greek, Italian, and Jewish people. And so I think many people, including myself, I grew up over in the Grandin area, didn't realize that these neighborhoods were kind of born with these restrictive covenants as part of them. And unfortunately, that really appealed to a lot of white people who were moving to the boomtown and wanted to be segregated. And as Roanoke grew, more and more families would move there, and the property values would rise. And as we'll see in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about redlining. That comes later in the 1930s. Redlining just kind of further cements these neighborhoods as, quote, more desirable. And they're more desirable to lend to by banks, but they're more desirable by the people moving there because of this perceived, protection that they felt in their own insular way. And then it continued this kind of feedback loop of positive valuations in the neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants. And when we learn about redlining in a second, these neighborhoods all had very high valuations by the federal government or by the Federal Home Loan Bank. And the neighborhoods that didn't have the deed restrictions had the opposite and were considered hazardous. So in the 1930s, 1934, the Federal Housing Administration creates this program through the Federal Home Loan Bank where they go through neighborhoods and create criteria for underwriting mortgages. And the idea was, I think, perhaps to be more efficient in the process for banks lending. They could easily find out where their risk was looking at different neighborhoods. This is Roanoke's redlining map, and you can find just about any city in Virginia online through a website called Mapping Inequality. And zoom in on whichever section you want to see. So we're zoomed in on downtown, and the section that is not colored is commercial and industrial districts downtown. Lower left-hand corner is Old Southwest, with the 2 stars show the properties that Restoration Housing did. The 3 stars on the right are in Southeast. The Belmont neighborhood was also redlined. The large red section in the middle and north is Gainsboro, Loudoun, Northwest. Large sections of Northeast were also redlined. And then our property that we restored at Villa Heights in the far left corner, Villa Heights neighborhood, was actually yellow lined, which is, as was Old Southwest, which was not as terrible of a report card as the red, but it was also not great. It was considered, if you can read that small little description in the corner, definitely declining. So the Federal Home Loan Bank went through different neighborhoods and determined if they were either, quote, best, still desirable, definitely declining, or hazardous. Throughout the country, if you look at most neighborhoods that were redlined, the majority of the hazardous neighborhoods were populated by African Americans. As you can see, Southeast here, Southeast did not have a large percentage of African Americans at the time, but it was still redlined, I think largely because another criteria for determining it as hazardous was just the number of people living in poverty there at the time. So really trying to make this process efficient ultimately made it impossible for people in these neighborhoods to get lending from banks to own their own homes or to mortgage and made it very undesirable to sell your property at maybe what its original value had been. You can't see in this map because I'm zoomed in, but as you can imagine, the neighborhoods that had the restrictive covenants, as I mentioned before, are blue. So South Roanoke and Raleigh Court. And up there, I'm not exactly sure what neighborhood that is up there, and I should know if anyone else does. Little pockets. I don't think Roanoke had a green neighborhood. But all that to say, these two efforts kind of play into each other, where people start to see rising property values, then the redlining confirms the rising property values, and then further cements the devaluing property values in the neighborhoods that are deemed hazardous. So I attended a conference a couple of years ago where some Richmond city planners were talking about their redlining maps, and they put them next to a map of the city's vacant and blighted properties, and you could see this direct correlation between the map 80 years later showing the most deteriorated homes in the neighborhood, in the city, and the redlining maps. And so when I got home, I got the same data from our police department of our vacant properties in the city. And you can see the direct correlation, and especially in the Gainsborough, Loudoun Northwest and Southeast. There's a lot in Old Southwest, even though Southwest, like you can see, was just valued yellow. But 80 years later, after redlining, you can see this profound effect that is not profound, I guess, just remarkable and upsetting for the long-term effects of not allowing people to gain wealth or opportunities in their neighborhoods because of that devaluation. But 80 years later, you can see it did take a long time to see these changes. It wasn't an immediate shift when redlining occurred. But like I was saying, there were other factors at play that were happening before, leading up to this, along the same time, the deed restrictions and all these efforts at passing ordinances and white flight, and it all kind of, played into each other. Eventually, in the 1940s, restrictive covenants are shot down by the Supreme Court, and that would be good news, but like I said, you still have this momentum, this negative feedback loop, and you still have white flight and people looking for good property values. And good property values just seems like a code word once you learn about this a little bit more. And so what happens is that this leads to the gradual devaluation of homes and neighborhoods where African Americans and other ethnic groups were allowed to live. And this is in the West End. This is Patterson and Marshall. And a gradual increase in values where predominantly white citizens lived. So this goes on for a big portion of the 20th century. I would say you see the beginnings of it in the 20s, a lot of this happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But then in the 60s, you start to see some progressive legislation that is promising, I think, in many ways. You have the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and basically ended Jim Crow. And then you have the Fair Housing Act, which outlaws discrimination based on race as it pertains to housing. And this really helped shift housing discrimination, and it helped integrate businesses. But it's just one of those tricky, complicated things that can be sort of a double-edged sword. So if you go back to Gainsborough and this insular, thriving community that it was, it suddenly no longer had to be so insular. And when I talked to Jordan about this, he told me how suddenly African Americans wanted to explore further outside of Gainsborough to white-owned businesses that they were suddenly allowed to go to. But the sad reality was that it didn't go back the other way. And white citizens did not suddenly start coming to use Black-owned businesses. And coupled with the inability to receive loans and insurance, and this being a redlined part of the city, Gainsborough suffered probably more heavily than any other older neighborhood in Roanoke, especially the Henry Street commercial corridor, leaving it very blighted and vacant. And then in the 1950s, I know I just moved forward, I'm a little bit backwards, but this spans the 1950s and the 70s. Across the country, neighborhoods like Gainsborough were targeted because of their blight and vacancy. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, initiating the interstate highway system. And cities are looking for ways to create new connections to the highway system. And what I call urban renewal, they would have called redevelopment, and targeting blighted areas, decided to partner, in Roanoke's case, with the Roanoke Housing Authority to seize large sections of blighted and vacant neighborhoods, and then in the name of eminent domain, and destroy them so that they could create new highway systems, interstate systems, and new buildings for, quote, economic development. This happened all throughout the country, not just in Roanoke, but in Roanoke specifically. We know that this is, largely affected Northeast and Gainsborough. It's where the Berglund Center currently is, where 581 connects to all of that jumble of downtown, Wells Avenue and Henry Street. Again, I'm not an expert. Jordan is and could speak in depth on this subject matter more than I could. But to contextualize it, it largely affected Gainsborough more than any other neighborhood of these older historic neighborhoods that I'm speaking about. The homes that were seized were purchased, but they were purchased well below their value. They were then bulldozed or burned. This went on for over 14 years. And if you look, like I said, this happened everywhere. And when I lived in California, it happened there too. And in every case, cities used the justification of blight removal, but in every case, if you look at the neighborhoods that they were doing this to, they were almost always large minority population neighborhoods that lacked political power to be able to stand up for themselves and prevent something like this from happening. So, considering all of these insidious policies and restrictions, you can see the myriad ways that race has been codified into land use with really detrimental outcomes, especially in Roanoke, but everywhere. I mean, these practices, redlining and urban renewal, happened all throughout the country, specifically in the South, or more often in the South than everywhere else, but Roanoke's own versions, I think, tell an interesting story too, because Roanoke did grow heavily during the Jim Crow era, where if you look at some older southern cities, they couldn't necessarily create their cities around these racial restrictions and restrictive policies because they weren't growing at the speed that our city was. So in some ways, Roanoke can be slightly more insidious. So I wanted to get back to where we are now with the properties that are deteriorating as a result of all of this disinvestment, devaluation, and the substandard living conditions that subsequently proliferate. So, like I said, while redlining was largely race-based, there were also many majority white neighborhoods that were redlined, such as Southeast, because of the percentage of poor residents who lived there. As a result, Southeast has a an almost 17% vacancy rate of its entire housing stock, and much of it is in poor condition, whether it's occupied or not. When people began to leave these neighborhoods in the 20s and 50s, the houses were often bought at really distressed prices because, like I said, there was no property value left. And they were bought by slumlords, for lack of a better term. If anybody has a better term for that, I would love to know. I've tried to find one. I feel bad saying it, but I just don't know what else to say. Because they had no value and because these owners knew they could get no value in resale, they would put very little investment back into them. And so they'd rent them out at affordable prices, but very substandard, undesirable living conditions. Like I said, exposed wires and no heating or cooling and rotting floors, rotting ceilings, and as I might say more generally, just really bad energy, because I don't know how else to describe the feeling when you walk into a room that feels so neglected and so depressing that you know a family just was living in not months before. And so families all over Roanoke's older neighborhoods live in these conditions in the houses that are deteriorating but occupied. And so this property we rehabbed a few years ago, and its owner, the landlord that owned it before we took ownership of it, owned over 40 properties around Old Southwest, Southeast, and Gainsborough when he passed away. He actually owned the house, the second house, the one on Patterson, that we restored as well. We were able to purchase them through his estate after he passed away. But he had owned many of them for decades and decades, and this is really common. Other landlords I've met own over 70 properties in these neighborhoods and rent them out to people with very limited opportunities and very limited incomes. The properties rarely meet code, but the landlords still, they'll threaten eviction from complaints from the tenants. And like I said, these are tenants with limited opportunities, probably feel very disempowered to fight back. And landlords often skirt around court appearances and fines, and somehow these conditions are just able to continue. And so what we see now are the long-term effects of both codifying race and poverty into land use. Blighted, vacant properties and neighborhoods, and terrible outcomes for the families that live in them. And the negative health outcomes are all I read about now. There's so much data in science, but negative educational and employment outcomes. There's a lot of data now showing much higher rates of COVID in redlined neighborhoods. It's really astounding. And so, again, I'm not going to end on a depressing note this way. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I think that there have been some efforts and recognition more broadly of this disinvestment and efforts to reverse the effects. They all feel very inadequate, but the federal government, or in the late 1970s, the law was passed, the Community Reinvestment Act, that requires banks and lenders to give back to neighborhoods that have been systematically devalued, specifically redlined neighborhoods. So that looks like banks giving low interest loans, giving grants to my organization. They will sponsor events, which we have been the beneficiary of. They have to do it, and they've been doing it for so long that I don't think they begrudge it quite as much as they might have originally. One banker I talked to said that they were paying for the sins of their fathers, and I believe that. I think they could pay a little bit more, but they, that, and the federal government has community development block grant funding, which is given to cities, and then cities give it away to nonprofits. It's large grants to revitalize neighborhoods that have been devalued over time. So that our organization has been the beneficiary of that as well as Habitat for Humanity, Renovation Alliance, TAP, a lot of nonprofits that are reinvesting in neighborhoods throughout Roanoke get this funding. So these are efforts by the federal government, I think, to understand their role in helping communities, even though in many cases I look at, yes, the federal government was part of the problem, but our own community was a big part of the problem too. And I just look, I need to go back a few slides. This slide, I meant to say earlier, there was this sermon that Reverend McPhail gave, I think a few years ago, about the different sects of Christianity creating kind of divisive ways to interpret theology, and how we then use that to measure ourselves against each other, and how it all starts with just a few people in a small room. And I just look at this picture and I think of the same thing, how divisive these ordinances and deed restrictions and all these efforts were, just created by a little group of people in a small room, but they have these just amazingly terrible, but you just can't imagine long-term negative effects on neighborhoods and communities. And I don't think anybody realized it at the time, how detrimental it would be. And a lot of urban planning and land use is making bad decisions and then trying to correct them over time. And I think city planners do try to do a good job with that. Our city planners now in Roanoke, largely I've found to be really progressive in their thinking and trying to reinvest and I think just bring critical thinking to the kind of work that they do. But I found faith-based groups to be probably the most inspiring in trying to reinvest in communities. This is a picture of the congregation from the Hill Church. They are trying to restore the inside of a vacant church in Northwest, the Villa Heights Baptist Church. It was vacated by a white congregation that left in white flight to another part of Roanoke and abandoned the church. And they had been vacant for many decades, and the Hill Church is restoring it. I think they're having their services in the nave during the restoration project in this picture. And their pastor, Charles, is really inspiring, a great community leader, and doing a lot to bring I think a lot of diversity to his congregation, a lot of awareness of the community needs, working in Northwest, trying to invest in small businesses and nonprofits and have it be a community space. And I'm also, there's so many great faith-based groups that I've been inspired by, but this is Kingdom Life Ministries that I have a personal relationship with. They are the lead anchor tenant of Villa Heights, the property that we restored in Northwest. The church uses it as a satellite space. They also own and operate their main church in Northwest, and then they sublease the space to 3 nonprofits, and they use the space for church events as well. And it was used for a virtual school last year, and it was used for several vaccine clinics, and they brought people from around the neighborhood there. And they're just doing really great, inspiring work, I think, to bring life back to buildings and neighborhoods in their neighborhood that have been neglected. And I think doing that from the ground up in a way that is more inspiring to me sometimes than seeing efforts at changing policies and practices more broadly. So to give You all, if you're interested in more information in this, you all probably, many people might be familiar with Mary Bishop's work, but where I kind of started to dig into these topics a few years ago, it started with her work. She is a writer, or a retired writer for the Roanoke Times, that wrote extensively on urban renewal, that really, her work became a big part of Mindy Fullove's work in writing Root Shock, which I know is in your list of, or the Becoming a Beloved Communities book list. It's a book about urban renewal, which Roanoke is heavily featured in. And Mary Bishop wrote extensively on it. She also wrote a lot about what she called the invisible inner city, on a lot of the other parts of Roanoke's older neighborhoods. The living conditions, the neighborhood conditions, the lack of economic opportunity. And you can find it online or at the Virginia Room, and it's a great start. This was written decades ago, but it's still really relevant. And I think for me was sort of very influential. And then there were also 2 other resources that I recommend to add to that list. Not that you asked, but if you'd like. The Color of Law is about redlining and urban renewal and deed restrictions all throughout the country, by Richard Rothstein. This is a great book, very extensive history of these policies outside of Roanoke. And then What Can and Can't Be Said is a book that was written in 2015 about monuments in the South, and that may not immediately sound relevant, but it is. It was written by my thesis advisor, and I thought it was a little ahead of its time. It was right before a lot of the discussions started coming about removing monuments, and it's beautifully written, very scholarly too, but it talks so much about this tension between white citizens' perceived threat to their own power and this reactionary building. And I felt like there's such a direct, for me, I think it feels so similar to what I see in these efforts to create laws and segregation is always from this perceived threat to power that is not real and is so restrictive. And he also does a really great job demystifying the concept of cultural heritage in the name of monument building. So I highly recommend it. And also today was the day they took down the Lee Monument, which is just couldn't be more appropriate as a great book. So the last thing I wanted to end on, this house in Northwest, this is where I'm still learning quite a bit, and I have a long way to go because my organization restored this property a few years ago, and I was really proud of it. It had been vacant for 10 years. It had suffered from a exposed hole in the roof, lots of water damage, a fire. I mean, it just needed so much work. And we got it listed on the National Register. We got community development block grant funding. It was a big effort. And when the city approached us to take on this project, I met with a bunch of community leaders of various neighborhood groups in Northwest. There was not a neighborhood group in the neighborhood of Villa Heights where it's located, because that group used to meet in this house and had nowhere to meet and had since disbanded. So it was groups all around this neighborhood, but not that neighborhood. And they got their full support. They were really excited for our organization to restore this house, and they wanted us to do it. And I went in there very naively thinking that this is what's best for the community. And I just felt, like I said, very proud of it for a while. And then about a year after it had been finished, talking to one of the nonprofits that's one of the subtenants there, realized that that they had wanted to restore the property many years before our organization had been approached, and that they had gone to the city and the city had ignored them, and that they still felt the wounds of that. I think the term white savior for me is something I never wanted to admit about myself, but the fact that I had thought I was fixing a problem in a neighborhood that's not my own. And just realizing that for people that live there, how that just sort of further added to the resentment and to the pain to have someone come in and say, I'm going to fix this for you. And I feel this constant tension between the pride of having restored this house and the knowledge that that my privilege and situation and my outsiderness should not have been a reason to be able to go in so easily and do that. And I'm so much more aware, but again, still learning how to be better at forming partnerships and working with existing community leaders and listening to them, and then giving as much of my time, but not trying to pretend that it's something that I can fix or that I even should fix. And that's hard because I live in Botetourt and I want to fix houses, and there are all these beautiful houses. It's very hard. I will always be an outsider, and I've got a long way to go, but doing this has taught me quite a lot. So that's it.
We have time for questions if you would like to pass those forward. And while those are coming forward, thank you so much, Isabel. This was just outstanding, and thank you for being so authentic.
Well, thank you for having me and for inviting me. I'm flattered. Thank you.
I'll ask the first couple of questions. Isabel, if people have been moved by your presentation and would like to contribute in some way, either volunteer their time or their financial resources to restoration housing, what would you suggest?
Is that your question, Virginia? I have a sign-up sheet here if anybody wants to get added to our newsletter. I recommend that as a great monthly newsletter, not too often, that will give you information about what we're up to, any events, the grants we received, the projects we're starting, all of that. There's usually links to donate in those newsletters, or you can just go to our website, which is restorationhousing.org. But if you sign up here, we'd love to add you in and just keep everybody in the loop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Question from the audience. I think you said Jim Crow laws in the 1890s created the black neighborhood of Gainsborough. Where did black citizens of Roanoke live prior to that?
Well, Gainsborough was around before that. It was actually, I believe here, and Jordan, you can tell me, you probably know this better than anyone, but Gainsborough was around before Roanoke was even formally established. And it was one of the oldest parts of this area. And it then became the section of the city that the city decided was segregated later. But before that, they lived all around the city. I mean, wherever there wasn't a lot of development in the 1890s. So you would have had gosh, I'm trying to think what neighborhoods were even really established then, but there were no segregated or like distinctly African American neighborhoods before that.
Okay. How long has restoration housing been in existence, and how many houses have you renovated?
So I believe 7 years, is that right? Yeah, and we are getting ready to start our 6th project this fall. Yeah, any day now.
As a nonprofit, how do you utilize tax credits to facilitate construction?
Oh yeah, that's complicated. So we create LLC businesses for each property that we restore, and we our nonprofit manages the property LLC, but we have to syndicate the tax credits to either a business or high net worth individual that has a tax liability high enough to, because the tax credit's a direct tax deduction. And so for Villa Heights, for instance, had $400-some thousand worth of tax credits. We sold them to a company, and that company buys into the LLC membership. This is so much more than you probably wanted to know, but they own 99.9% of the property as a silent partner, and we own and manage the property for 5 years, and then that partnership dissolves, and then we own it completely outright. And that's because of IRS tax compliance. For federal tax credits, we combine state and federal, but the federal require a 5-year period of ownership by the either individual or corporation that is using the credits. So they get a $400-something thousand deduction, and then they give us back $280,000, and then we use that as direct equity for the construction costs, and they make a little over $100,000 just by being our partner, and that's it. Yeah, just very complicated.
For those currently living in substandard housing, are there limitations for accurate housing choices? No, that must be something else. Driven by alternative housing choices driven by cost, affordability, or something else?
All right, let me just read this closely, okay? Okay, is it driven by affordability or something else? Yes. So one begets the other. So family that makes 60% of the area median income would be a family. So it's different based on family size. But if you have a family of 4 making between, say, $30,000 and $40,000 a year, which would be 2 minimum wage jobs, they have very, very little income beyond their basic housing and transportation needs. So if they have, say, a slight change in their circumstances and suddenly have a medical bill or something, or a car issue, they suddenly are without any extra resources. And that particular family size, people in the affordable housing world see a lot in this this negative loop of they basically bounce around between slumlord conditions, because if they can't make rent a few times, they get evicted. If they get an eviction on their record, they can't get housing somewhere better. Even if there is affordable housing that's a better quality option, they have an eviction on their record. Or if they ever get one minor offense on their record and they're landlords with really high standards, they end up, if you have an offense on your record, the wrong kind of credit, an eviction notice, all of these things, these little things add up for families with very small margins of income beyond their basic needs that they end up going to landlords that don't require credit checks, that don't require a clean eviction history, but those landlords tend to be very tricky in their own way. So it just is this negative feedback loop where then they might go and live in one of these properties and the landlord won't fix their heat or won't fix their plumbing. And if they say something, the landlord would evict them again. And so there's a large percentage of families in Roanoke that are in this middle of the affordable housing world. The very low income world actually has a few more subsidies available, either through rental vouchers or other supportive services. But the 50 to 60% families often have these, little issues with their records that give them fewer opportunities.
What is the percentage gap in rental costs of substandard to standard housing?
Okay, let's see. Well, I guess I would argue that substandard and standard, in our case, I think you could see we try to match the same costs. We try to have affordable rents that is a high quality alternative to the substandard that are at low rents. And so there doesn't have to be a big variation, but it really is essential probably that we're a nonprofit, because we're able to fundraise and we're able to get other resources to make and invest in our properties so that we don't have to charge a lot of rent, but our properties have a high quality. So I don't know, it all depends on the landlord. And I'm going into too much detail, I think, in these questions, but I could go on and on about landlords, their definition of standard and affordability. But yeah, I think I don't know that there's like a direct correlation. Yeah.
Is restoration housing involved with helping low-income families finding housing? That's a second.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Yes, that's exactly what we do. So after we restore the properties, we, except for Villa Heights, of course, which is the one outlier commercial nonprofit tenant, all of our properties are housing. All of them are for families, except for one property. The yellow house that I showed you all is for formerly homeless individuals, because it's a complicated reason why, but largely because the city determined the highest need for housing formerly homeless in Roanoke was for individuals, not families. So we oriented towards the needs, but all we look for are people that that meet our criteria for having lower income. Some of that's based off of HUD standards. When we receive CDBG funding through the city, that goes through HUD, and HUD determines, exactly what income the family is that we need to target to live in those properties. So it's partially our mission and partially a criteria of our grant funding.
Is there any rent control in the Roanoke Valley? How did that happen in New York City?
Oh, I wish I was more well-versed in New York City's housing history. Is anyone here who can speak about it? I don't know how it happened there, except I'm sure just some kind of great progressive effort at one time that got solidified. I don't know of any rent control in Roanoke. I guess what I would argue is Roanoke doesn't have the same affordable housing problems that some cities that are growing exponentially do. When you hear about affordable housing as a crisis across the country all the time on the news, you often hear about it in Palo Alto, in DC, in Alexandria, in New York, and Brooklyn. And these neighborhoods are growing so fast that affordable housing is just impossible to find, and impossible to keep. In Roanoke, we don't have that same population growth and that same tension, but we do need more high quality affordable housing because so much of what is there is substandard. So in Roanoke, I don't know that rent control would solve the problem as much as just we need to get out the slumlords and basically just create alternative, opportunities that are affordable. We do need a lot of affordable housing, but there already is a lot of it there. It's just not great.
Mm-hmm. Do you hire all the work done on your restoration projects, or can volunteers contribute time to these projects, time and labor to these projects?
So we have used the same contractor for every project. It's a huge secret to any success we've had because that contractor is really easy to work with and really good at historic rehabs. And because of historic tax credits, the way that they work is we need to monetize we need to capture the real costs of the rehab and make those costs more desirable to our tax credit investors. That being said, so if we had more volunteer labor and fewer labor costs, we'd have fewer credits and fewer investors interested in our projects. So we do invite volunteers to help us with beautifying the landscapes. Once a year we do something called Community Partnership Day, where we invite, last year we just had staff and no one else for obvious reasons, but this year we may open it up a little bit more. It'll be October 23rd, which is also a day of service for remembrance of Tim Dayton, who was a pastor in Southeast who passed away last year. And he wanted people to do community service projects in his honor that day. So we're trying to time it that day. If anybody wants to help lay some sod, plant some shrubs. We usually do that at the very end of the construction process so that our construction workers won't tromp all over everything that we just planted. And then the landscape will be nice and ready to go for the new tenants right before they move in.
Okay, and one I think we've already answered, but the last one will be just today. I read that a new highway is going through Charleston, South Carolina, and will impact mostly minorities and where they live. Why haven't we learned?
Why haven't we learned? I don't think I'm in the right position to answer that question. I hope that there's a lot of community pushback there. I don't know. There's a lot more people trying to bring collective voices together to bring more political power and more social justice in these instances, but it's upsetting. It just perpetuates. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
Thank you so very much, Isabel.
My pleasure.
You've really enlightened us. And we thank all of you for coming, and stay tuned for more from the Becoming Beloved community. You will see things posted on our website, and we hope you will continue to join us as this organic happening grows. Thank you.
Thank you.